Hello, everybody. Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm very pleased to be back in this room. I haven't been here in a very long time, but we are trying to get back into the swing of things with face-to-face events, and so I'm pleased to see some of our favorites, oldies but goodies that are back the way they have always been. So we're very pleased to see that, as well as some new faces as well. Good to see you as well. For those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Courtney Shaw, and I'm the facilitator of the series, and I'm also today's speaker. So nobody's going to introduce me. I guess I have to introduce myself. I teach history here at LCC. I've been doing that for 14 years. I teach U.S. and world civilizations, and U.S. is my specialty, so whenever I end up giving a talk, which is usually because we don't get enough volunteers, and I'm like, oh crap, that's why I get to go first, because nobody volunteers to go first. It's like, well, I guess I'm going first. So I like to give sort of a historical perspective on this. So when we talk this quarter about the lifespan from prenatal to the end, what are the kind of things that we talk about? And instead of looking at contemporary issues, I'm going to take it back and talk about how we've defined these things throughout the past. So I've titled my talk today, Grow Up America, and we're going to start with some polling. So you can go to pollev.com/CourtneyShaw150, and I have a question for you, which is, at what age does someone become an adult? And this is your opinion. This doesn't have to be backed up with anything. I just want to know what you think. So you can go to that website, or you can, on your phones, text Courtney Shaw 150 to the number 37607. That'll enter you into the poll, and then you'll answer the question for the age 22. You put A. For 21, you put B. For 20, you put C, etc. And so you can answer that. And I'm curious to know what people think about this. The number you're texting to is 37607.
You put in the words and then two and then the numbers, or do you put in the number?
You're sending to the number 37607, and the text you're sending is Courtney Shaw 150. Oh, good, we're getting some responses. Happens to the best of us. You don't have to do this. It's just an option. All right, so we got 21. We've got 20. Ooh, we got an other. I'm going to ask about that. And if you're sharing a phone, you can enter more than one answer, so that does allow for that. Okay. So if the person who said other wants to respond, what makes you choose other, and what would you say instead? Yeah?
I said when you are able to take care of yourself and able to take care of others, everything else is public opinion according to the law of sex.
Okay.
An example of, like, you hear the stories of brothers and sisters that don't have a father or mother, and so the brother, whoever's the oldest, has to take care of the sibling.
Okay, so you're saying it's not age-related, it's more like circumstance-related, basically. Okay, I like that idea, yeah. Okay, so we got some good answers here. We've got several votes for 21, 20, 18, 16, and then maybe not age-specific here. Okay, I'm going to play around with this a little bit. I'm going to close this question and open up another one. So So same thing, you can go to the same website or text the same number. What rights or responsibilities do you think makes someone an adult? For example, and this is, you're just filling in the blank here. It could be marriage, the right to drink, getting a job, however you might define this. I'm curious to know how you would say when somebody becomes an adult. What are their rights or responsibilities? Oh, I tell my kids that all the time. Making good choices and accepting the consequences. Self-support. Joking inappropriately. Job, taxes, caring for self and family unit, caring for oneself and others, ability to admit when you're wrong or mistaken. Woo! There's a lot of people that I know that are not adults yet. Having your own home, paying your bills, appointments, putting your responsibilities first, and being self-sufficient. You guys have some good ideas about what it means to be an adult. All right. Okay, any other? Oh, good, we do. Able to comply and adhere to the Bill of Rights. Excellent. Okay, so this is kind of a fun little exercise to look at sort of the numbers, because that is sort of legally how we define adulthood in the United States, is by, shall we say, fairly arbitrary dates. Like once I am 16, I can drive. Once I am 18, I can vote. Once I am 21, I can drink. But then also, there's a lot more subjective stuff going on here. When do I truly become independent? When am I self-sufficient? When am I able to care for others? When do I take responsibility for my actions? So this is some very interesting, and you guys you're feeling my vibe, which I like very much. Okay, so I'm going to close that down, get back into the presentation here. So when we look at the history of what it means to be an adult, because that is what I do. I look at history, change over time. We can look at how the United States compares with other areas of the world. And in general, legal structures do define adulthood, or the age of majority, the age at which you become not a minor anymore, but an adult, as, based on your age. And if we see this map here, and this is from Wikimedia Commons, my apologies. Generally speaking, a lot of it is at 18, and that is the green color there. So the United States, for the most part, defines adulthood at 18. We do have a few states that differ on that, but some of them put them at 19. I know the first time I went to Canada, I went to British Columbia, and I was 19 at the time, and so I was like, oh my God, I'm an adult. I can go to a bar. This is so exciting, right? But you have a lot of other places that define it as 21. You go to Madagascar, you have to wait till you're 21, right? And then there's also a few that define it at 16. So this really does depend on what the legal structure is in the place that you are, and that depends on the culture, right? Our laws reflect our culture. Our laws reflect what values we hold and what our community determines is appropriate. So how do we make that determination? Well, we have lots of ways in the United States, in a lot of different cultural groups within the United States, that we define coming of age. And coming of age can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. So for instance, we have here, this is the Apache people in the American Southwest, and they have a rite of passage that is defining when a girl becomes a woman. And usually this is defined based on menarche, based on when they start menstruating, which is a little iffy because not everybody menstruates, and certainly not everybody menstruates on the same schedule. But generally speaking, they're looking at about the ages of 12 to 14 is when a girl becomes a woman. Now, does this mean that she is a full-fledged adult in the community? No. But she is training to become so. She is learning from her elders to take a more responsible role in her community and to eventually become the head of her family, to marry or to have children or to take on adult responsibilities. And I do love this photo here. I think it's very beautiful, the idea that the older cousin is guiding her younger cousin into this and taking her through the ritual. We have other ways. I don't know why, but I was thinking longingly of my 10 years that I lived in Texas, and I chose this particular photo because this is Herman Park, which is not too far from where I lived when I lived in Texas, and we used to see quinceañera parties there all the time. And so in Mexican-American culture and a lot of Latino cultures, you have the idea of a quinceañera, or 15th birthday party, for a young woman, and this is her coming-of-age ritual. And again, she's not a full-fledged adult in the community, but she is often seen as now entering into the dating world or the courting world, where she might be forming romantic relationships and adult relationships and eventually moving towards marriage. So a quinceañera is a celebration of a girl becoming a woman set at her 15th birthday. In Jewish culture, you have the bar mitzvah, which is a ceremony marking a boy's passage from boyhood into manhood, and this is done at the age of 13. This is a tradition that is very, very, very old. More recently, a lot of Reform Jewish communities will include a bat mitzvah for girls as well. But basically, this is where you are beginning to adopt the adult role within your religious community. You are subject to the rules of the Torah, for instance. You are considered to be morally culpable for the things you do once you are a man or a woman. And so there is a training that goes into this. You go to Hebrew school, you learn language, you learn ethics and responsibilities, and then you have a celebration. You have a party that goes with this. And so this is coming of age within a lot of Jewish communities as well. And something that is not as popular nowadays as it was 50 or 100 years ago certainly is the debutante ball. This is something that I didn't have any experience with myself, but when I went to college in North Carolina, I met debutantes, and I was thrown, I guess would be a good way of putting it. I didn't know this still existed. I had read about this in romance novels, but I had never actually met anybody who'd gone through this. A debutante ball is popular amongst wealthy elites, very wealthy elites often run through things like country clubs or elite social clubs, in which young women, it used to be generally 16-year-olds, but it is sort of extended into college-age women as well. They are moving from girlhood into adulthood, and kind of like the quinceañera, they are now out into society. They can date, they can court, they can move towards marriage. And it used to be that this was basically your introduction into the dating world. Now it's much more sort of seen as a coming-of-age ritual rather than an introduction to society. If you are familiar with novelists like Jane Austen talking about the daughters who are out in society, this is basically the same concept, is that prior to being introduced in society, you are not eligible to go hang out with men. So being out in society is sort of this idea that you are now marriageable. You are now, to use a fairly yucky phrase, out on the market, right? Because dating is, of course, a market. I have issues. Anyway, so this is another rite of passage that we see common in England, common in the United States a while ago, not as common nowadays, although it does still exist. This one is from 2019. They didn't have the New Orleans, this is 2018, sorry. They didn't have the New Orleans debutante ball last year for reasons, but they do have this every year. So it still does exist amongst these sort of elite, wealthy communities as well. And of course, then there's this. Again, I mentioned I lived in Texas for 10 years, and nothing quite hits home with my Texan experience so much as the show King of the Hill. And if you're not familiar with this, this is an animated series that is about the life of a family in Texas. And we have the dad, Hank, and his son, Bobby, and Bobby is coming of age, right? So Bobby is going to go on his first hunt. And this is Bobby's imagination of how the hunt will go.
Go get him, Bobby.
No, we're a team.
Bobby, I just want to say that you are perfect and a man.
So once you have your first hunt or your first kill, you are clearly a man. Now, if you're not familiar with the series, it does go a little bit differently in reality. Bobby goes on the hunt. He realizes he really doesn't want to shoot a deer, and his dad says that's okay, and then they end up hitting a deer on the way home with their car. So he has made his first kill. Not intentionally, but it ended up that way anyway. So we have a lot of different visions of how somebody comes of age, but these are all cultural. These are all particular subgroups or particular, by class, by religion, by race, by ethnicity, how we define what it means to be an adult. And there's a long history to a lot of this. So oh no, I don't want to play it again. Pardon. So if we go back to colonial America, and you talk about coming of age in colonial America, we often have little sort of stereotypes. And the stereotypes, of course, is that, people came of age really young back in the day, right? You get a job, go work. And part of that is true. The getting a job and going to work part definitely was. So I did a little searching on this, and a lot of this material is from John Demos's book, A Little Commonwealth, which talks about family life in the New England colonies. And one of the big points that Demos makes is that children were from a very young age in training to be adults. This was your job as a parent, was to train up those kids, to make them productive members of society, to make them ready to take on adult responsibilities. And first and foremost of that is labor. They need to be able to do work because colonial life was hard, and you need people's labor in your household in order to make the household run. And so often, children were considered to be quote-unquote little adults. And I love this portrait here of the Mason children, which has them dressed as adults. It has them posed just like their mothers or fathers might be, and really taking on these adult responsibilities or the look of an adult responsibility at a pretty young age. I will also warn you, never Google colonial children portraits and then forget about it and come back to it. You'll scare the crap out of yourself. I did that one day. I came back and I'm like, freaky kids. Anyway, this is what I got. This is one of my favorites here. But often children would be what was called bound out, which is basically entering into an apprenticeship of some sort at a fairly young age. I'm going to say it's a very young age, 7 or 8 years old. That's young. So imagine, if those of you who might have had children, imagine, if you will, your 7 or 8 year old going off to live in somebody else's household to be trained up in a career. Maybe they're learning to be a blacksmith. Maybe they're learning to be a carpenter. Maybe they're learning domestic service. This is not just boys. This is also young girls who would be trained in the jobs that they are required to do. And there's a lot of work that goes for whatever your particular gender assignment is or your class. So this was done at a pretty young age. But that, again, doesn't mean that they are considered to be full-fledged adults, even if they're taking on jobs and responsibility. Their wages, for instance, would belong to their parents if they have a wage job. And they would not have sort of the rights of adulthood until they reach their 20s. So legally speaking, there is no one clear age in colonial America that says you are now an adult. But from the legal documents we see, inheritance was usually marked at the age of 21. So if I am a young man and I am due to inherit my father's property when he passes away, but he passes away when I'm 15, I don't get that property at 15. I get that property when I turn 21. So that could be considered sort of the age at which you are responsible for having your own household or having your own property. And we see this also with marriage. While there is no set marital age in which people are allowed to get married in colonial America, you do have general patterns where people are getting married. Usually for girls or women, it is in their early 20s, and for men, it's in their mid-20s. So this is based on, not just you've reached sexual maturity, go for it, but you've reached a level of sort of independence and discernment, shall we say, that you are now ready to go get married. Now, that's not to say that child marriage did not happen. My great-great-grandmother got married at 14. And that's not colonial, that's in the 1800s. So it does happen, but it is not the common pattern. Usually, marriage is something that happens in the 20s. And we do have some data on this. I pulled these from the US Census. The numbers prior to sort of the 20th century are a little scattered because we don't always have the data for all that. But if we look at this, we can see that even in the 1800s here, the age at marriage, the age at first marriage, I should say, was usually in the mid-20s for men and early 20s for women. It does take a little dip down in the 1950s. That's the baby boom. But then it's been steadily climbing ever since. But the idea of child marriage has never been common in the United States. It's never been a common practice. It does occur, and even today, you have the legal standard of saying, you need to be 18 to get married, unless you have parental permission. So people can get married younger if they have their parents' permission, and that does happen occasionally. So that exists, but it's not necessarily the defining feature of how we look at when you are ready to get married. Generally speaking, we assume that that is the 20s, when you're in your 20s. Okay. Now, something is going to happen in the 19th century, the 1800s, that's going to start to change our ideas about what childhood versus adulthood look like. And this is the Industrial Revolution. So in the United States, across the 1800s, we have the adoption of industrial technology and industrial workforces that's changing people's relationship to their jobs. Jobs are no longer in the home for a lot of people. More and more people are now going out to work in factories, in mines, in shops, in places like that, as opposed to being sort of under the supervision of a household. And that seems to be a little bit more troubling to a lot of people. And let's be honest, the conditions were pretty bad. So I have here a couple of photos. These are by Lewis Hine from 1908. So throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s, we have a problem of child labor. This idea that young children, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, are going out and working 14 hours a day at a factory. And that is wrong. We should not do that. So there is a movement in the late 19th and early 20th century to ban child labor or to restrict it, to not allow children to, and this is the kind of language they use, have their innocence taken from them by going into the factory, or to have their childhood ripped from them by going into the factory. And honestly, this is not good for kids. We can look physiologically at it, we can look psychologically at it, and say this is not good for child development. We're going to have several talks this quarter that talk about child development, brain development, things like that. And generally speaking, and I'm going to say this for adults as well, working 14 hours a day down at a factory or in a coal mine is probably not super good for your health. I love the 8-hour day. I'm a fan. Thank you, Thank you to all those union folk who demanded that back in the day. But what we have here is this idea of an outrage about that people working, young children working is somehow not right, and that we should change it and that we should protect childhood. And this is going to be seen changing over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century, mostly for wealthier people, because let's be honest, if the choice is to pull your child out of the factory or starve, people are going to send their kids to work if that's the only way they can get food. So for the wealthier people, they're like, yeah, we want to protect our children. We want to keep them in the household. We want to make sure that they are pure and innocent. But for the working class people, that's not really an alternative. And this kind of goes to another idea, is that if we look at the 19th century, can we look at enslaved children and say, when do they gain adulthood? They've always had to work. We have evidence of enslaved children having to do heavy labor from the age of 5. So are they adults because they've got a job? Well, no. They actually never gain the rights of adulthood. They have the responsibilities of adulthood, but they don't have the right to get married. They don't have the right to move away from their household. They don't have the rights of legal participation in society. So again, our definitions of adulthood is racially constrained as well, based on African American slavery. So we have different definitions depending on what your class is, what your gender is, what your race is. And for the upper middle class and the middle class, we see in the late 19th and early 20th century an extension of schooling into high school, into college for a lot of people. If you want to, be an upwardly mobile person who's going to get a good job, if you're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, a minister, something like that, you need more education. And so you see longer periods of time in which children are going to school. Compulsory schooling becomes common in the late 19th or early 20th century, meaning children are supposed to be in school rather than in the workforce. Does this apply to the children of sharecroppers in Mississippi? Heck no. This is very much constrained based on class, based on race, how this is enforced. So this is not the experience for all, but there is that rhetoric of reform saying we need to extend childhood and protect childhood from the difficulties of adulthood. And into the 20th century, we also see an interesting thing happening, which is we have a series of wars. Not necessarily new, we've always had wars, but these are big ones. World War I, World War II. And here we see one of the definitions of adulthood is you are eligible for military service. So for example, in World War I, the 1917 Conscription Act says that any male between the ages of 21 and 30 is eligible for the draft. So here we're setting the age of adulthood at 21 because you have to be grown up enough to, self-sufficient enough and grown up enough and, logical enough and thoughtful enough to go tote a gun over in France and kill some Germans. So this becomes part of our definition of adulthood is, can you serve in the military? And again, this is very, very defined by gender. Women are not eligible for the draft. So this is something that was defining manhood more than adulthood in itself. And that was what we did in World War I. In World War II, a generation later, the draft age changes. There is a demand for more soldiers. This is a bigger conflict that lasts longer. And the United States in 1942 opts to lower the draft age from 21 to 18. So here we are saying 18-year-olds are adult enough to go out and fight and possibly die for our country. And yet, they were not considered adult enough to vote. And this was a big, big conflict. And this becomes especially prevalent during the US-Vietnam conflict in the 1960s and 70s, when the draft again becomes a big political issue. The demand for soldiers again rises in an unpopular war. And a lot of 18 to 21-year-olds are thinking, 18 to 20-year-olds, how is it that I'm eligible for the draft, that I can go and fight for my country, but I can't cast a vote for the people who may or may not send me over there to fight for my country? So I chose this picture here from the Imperial War Museum because you can see just from the faces here, I think there's a wide range of ages represented here. We have older soldiers as well. They also raise the age of the draft from 30 to 36 because of the demand for more and more soldiers. But the third one back in the middle row, holy crap, that guy looks young, right? I'm like, that's a 12-year-old. What are you doing in that boat? So I definitely have, an interesting perspective and sort of an emotional reaction. And maybe this is because I have a 16-year-old son. But I see these young people going off to fight, and it tears at my heart and say, no, we must protect these young children, right? So that's my mother's instinct for that. But this was the reality of the time, right? It is the war. We gotta beat the Nazis, which, definitely, yeah, we gotta beat the Nazis. Nazis are bad. If anybody wants to take that up with me, let's go fight. But I'm holding my line and saying Nazis are bad. But generally speaking, we do have this idea of adulthood being tied to your right to vote and your right to fight for your country, or your responsibility to fight for your country. But those two things don't align based on age. So one of the things we see with that is the extension of the voting rights down to 18-year-olds. And this was actually a pretty long struggle. This isn't something that just popped up in 1971, although that is when it is ratified, the 26th Amendment. But this was something that Eisenhower mentioned in his State of the Union address back in 1954. And Eisenhower was a general in the military. He knew what he was talking about. He was saying, we cannot expect young men to be draft eligible and go over and fight for our country and not be able to have a voice in that country when they come back. So we need to lower the voting age. And this, of course, really picks up in the 1960s. This is the era of protests, of the student movements, of places like Berkeley getting shut down based on all sorts of protests, the free speech movement, civil rights, the anti-war movement. All of these things are simmering, and young people were incredibly active politically in these programs and these messages here. And when the 26th Amendment, which was going to lower the voting age to 18, was finally put on the docket, it is the fastest ratification of any constitutional amendment we've had. This goes fast. Now, there were still a lot of objections. Several states absolutely said, no, we're not on board with this. And they would say things like, young people cannot be trusted to be mature enough to vote. But they are trusted to be mature enough to carry a gun and go fight for their country. So there was a lot of tension over this. And in general, the United States, the Congress, the states, basically determined, yes, we need to have more sort of uniformity in the rights and responsibilities. And this is my big sort of takeaway, my thesis statement for this whole talk, is that adulthood is about rights, the right to do stuff, but also responsibilities. What are you expected to do? And that kind of goes back to a lot of the comments that you wrote at the beginning. You're expected to be self-sufficient. You're expected to take responsibility for yourself and for others. You're expected to contribute to your household. And you can have the right to do all sorts of things. But if you don't have that responsibility that goes with it, then you're just a toddler running free, right? So there's rights that come with adulthood, the right to drink, the right to smoke, the right to get married. There are responsibilities. I got to pay my bills. I got to pay my taxes. I got to take care of myself. I got to clean up after myself. I have to be beholden to my family and my children. I need to take care of those around me. I need to vote. That is a right and a responsibility, and I hope everybody participates in that. I'm a big believer. The best form of democracy is participatory democracy. So if you're not registered, go out and get registered. But to be an adult in this country is not necessarily just down to the math. It's not necessarily down to the number that is next to your name. It is about that fine balance between rights and responsibilities. And our system is fairly piecemeal on how they do that. We learn how to drive at 16. We can vote at 18, but we can't drink until we're 21. We can't rent a car until we're 25? It's a little weird, right? But recently, there is a lot of evidence that there is sort of this spectrum in which our brains develop. And this is something that Michael Strayer is going to talk much more about when he talks about the teen brain at the end of our quarter-long series, so pay attention to that. I do have flyers in the back that show our schedule for upcoming events. But in general, the idea of attaining adulthood, I would argue, is a spectrum. It's not like on my 18th birthday, I suddenly became an adult. Heaven knows I did not become an adult on my 18th birthday. It is a process. And perhaps it is wise that we get these stepping stones along the way, that we learn along the way to, I had my first job at 15. I learned how to drive at 16. I moved out of the house at 18. I lived on my own and paid my own bills at 22 when I finished college. Thank you, Mom and Dad. But generally speaking, this is a process that we go through. It is not something that happens immediately. It is not Bobby Hill shooting the deer with no blood. I love that aspect of the video there. But shooting the deer and all of a sudden everybody saying, yes, you are clearly now a man. There is training that goes into it. There is learning that goes into it. And often that learning is a lot of trial and error. And for that, I invite you to think about, perhaps, I don't know what your experiences are, but for me, one of the highlighting experiences is watching people's 21st birthday parties. And they learn. I have the right to drink. Oh crap, I am now throwing up all over everything. I have a responsibility to take care of myself and others and not throw up all over everything, right? We learn that over time. We are not given that on our birthday, whatever that birthday is. So in the United States, we do have a fairly slapdash system of defining adulthood. It depends on what state you're in, your age of consent, your age of rights to do all sorts of things. But we also have sort of this cultural understanding that this is a process, that this is not something that we figure out just out of the blue. We learn about it over time. And I think maybe that's not so bad. Maybe this idea of practicing adulthood as we go, somewhere between the ages of 15 and 21, we learn these things over time. And eventually, hopefully, we attain this idea of responsibility that makes us a full-fledged adult. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Yes?
What about the Korean War?
Korean War, yes. I could have brought up a lot of other conflicts here. The Korean War was shorter and didn't require as many soldiers as Vietnam, which is why it was not as contentious in a lot of ways. The longer we're in a war, the more people protest that war. So there was some concern over it, which is probably one of the things that Eisenhower was thinking about, because he's commander-in-chief while that's going on. But it was really Vietnam that sort of cracked it all open. Yeah, good question, though. Yes?
Yeah, because the Korean War was actually United Nations.
Yeah, Korean War was a United Nations action, not an actual declared war for the United States. Same with Vietnam, yeah.
And then, so, like myself, I joined the military at 17.
Mm-hmm.
Dad had signed me in. So if a parent signs in a 17-year-old to the military, the 17-year-old still does not have the right to vote, but starts paying actual taxes.
Oh, that's interesting. So to repeat, to pick up on the microphone here, joining the military at 17, having a parent sign them in, and that does not necessarily, like, you still can't vote, right? You're not ready, but you have to pay those taxes. So rights and responsibilities, very interesting. And that kind of goes back to another thing is if we are going to college, for instance, right out of high school, or we're taking a job right out of high school, we assume that those people can sign a contract, enter into a legal agreement, pay tuition, take a student loan, all those things. We're asking 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds to make these decisions that can impact the rest of their lives. And hopefully they're doing this within a family structure in which they are gaining support and wisdom and all that good stuff. That's not necessarily the case, right? So a lot of people are thrust into making adult decisions at a fairly young age that they might not be fully ready for. And joining the military would certainly be a major life decision. And hopefully it's something that, they want to do rather than something that they're pushed into in some way. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Yes?
Rites of passage, one of the things that's big in the Indian culture is the vision quest.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a lot of different independent organizations like Job's Daughters. They have they didn't call it a debutante ball, more like a coming out ball.
Yes, so she was commenting about other groups like Vision Quests for a lot of Native American groups, or the Job's Daughters. This idea of sort of a rite of passage from childhood into adulthood can take a lot of different forms. I'm very intrigued especially by the idea of a vision quest where somebody is entering into the wilderness, perhaps, or going out on their own. In Australia, amongst Aboriginal people, this would be the walkabout, right, where you are going out away from your family, away from your community, and figuring some stuff out. And that can be a difficult thing to do. You're not just looking at survival skills, but also like mentally processing what does everything mean to you. And you see that across a lot of cultures, which is very interesting. So it's not just about like entering into the dating market, but also entering into sort of self-sufficiency and determining for yourselves what you believe in and how you can take care of yourself in sort of an isolated situation like that. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Oh, yes.
You didn't really talk about drinking age, but
No.
I was of the age that was almost legal to drink, and then wasn't.
Yeah.
What's your take on that? Or do you have
I do actually, because when I went to go visit colleges, I went to North Carolina to visit colleges. I ended up going to college in North Carolina. And at that time, in the early 90s, the North Carolina drinking age was 19, as opposed to 21 in Oregon, which is where I'm from. And I thought it was interesting. It's like, oh, you're 19 and you get to drink here. And then, whoosh, that goes away. And it became 21 across the board. And the reason for that was the federal government basically said, you are not going to get any funding for highways unless you adopt 21 as your drinking age. So there we're looking specifically at the dangers of drunk driving, of driving under the influence. As far as like, it's really hard to look at sort of when are people ready to experiment with substances that might alter their experience. And I will also say I'm a big old square. I don't drink or do anything drug-wise, and so I'm probably not the best person to answer this. But in general, the idea here is that if you're going to be using a motor vehicle, and you are at 16, we really don't want you drinking yet. So don't put those two rights together before you gain the responsibility of making good choices about it. As far as like, I had military friends in college, people who were ROTC in college, and they're like, how come I can fight for my country but I can't have a beer when I get back? Fair point, right? I mean, if you are adult enough to serve your country, should you not be adult enough to be able to have a beer? And I don't really have an argument against that, even though I don't personally do it. Who am I to say that you can't? So I don't have like I know the reason why that got switched to 21. I don't really know if I agree with it, I guess would be the way I say it. Yeah. Sean?
Well, a big reason could be because of insurance.
Yeah, insurance. Very good point.
Yeah, but also, so when I left Bosnia, and I went back to Germany, I was 18.
Uh-huh.
So I didn't drink in Germany, and smoke in Germany
Yeah.
at the age of 18. And also the German families, as long as the kids were with them, they were able to drink at a younger age. Not like they're infants or that.
Right.
That they were being responsible, maybe a beer.
Yeah.
Not clown, 5 years. So.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
on top of that, with their driving over there compared to ours, it just doesn't weigh out because they don't have as much vehicular, accidents age-wise over there compared to here.
yeah. This is a good. So Sean brings up the point. If you couldn't hear that, that being overseas, you might have different drinking or smoking ages, and often that's like under the supervision of your family. So if you're out with your parents and they give you a glass of wine, you can have a glass of wine. And cars, the situation, like the United States is a car-centric nation. So insurance, highway safety, things like that are way at the forefront of our minds when it comes to substances that might be detrimental to your driving ability, that are not necessarily that big a deal in some places in Europe where driving is not the general experience. There's a lot more public transit, trains, and things like that. So drinking and vehicular accidents are not as closely tied as they would be in the United States. Yeah. 18? So it was 18 to drive in Germany? To rent. Oh, okay. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm.
For either financial needs or social needs, that it's just ludicrous.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a great point, that there's all these other contributing factors, especially financially, that shape this, like the insurance industry, like federal funding for highways and stuff. So, we're looking to keep people safe, but we're also, how do you make sure that you don't have major liability on your hands? So that raises some interesting points. In general, I would say, I do want to put up, because as a good historian, I need to do this, further readings. Where did I get my stuff? Cite my sources. So we do have a lot of interesting books, articles, websites that I took a look at. One that I will point out is very interesting is Holly White's article, Why We're Letting Americans Vote, Marry, and Drink Far Too Young. And she goes into a lot of the mushy brain concept, that we don't have our fully formed frontal cortex until we're into our 20s. And so why are we allowing people to do things that they shouldn't be doing without understanding the consequences of their actions? So you feel free to look at those to find out a little bit more on this. G. Stanley Hall's work on adolescence is really talking about this invention of adolescence as this time period between childhood and adulthood, where we are trying on adult responsibilities and sort of trying to come to terms with that while still having the protection and support of our families. So we're not just throwing people out at the age of 15 into the wilderness and saying, go figure it all out. And so adolescence sort of becomes this longer phase in between childhood and adulthood. And I think that's kind of, pretty prevalent in American society today, is this concept of adolescence is a time when people are figuring out how to take on greater responsibilities. And as the parent of 2 teenagers, I see this in action as well. And I also see in action that my kids are ready for some things and not ready for others. My daughter got a job this summer. Yay! She's not ready to take care of herself, but she can go earn a wage. She's good at that, but she's not necessarily ready to live on her own or do anything like that. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Please come back. In future weeks, we have our schedule on the back. And thank you to Anne for helping me out with all the details today. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you for obeying the rules.